Hello, how are you?
How are you?
Fine. I'm fine, thanks.
Okay.
I see recording has started. Can the host please enable transcription for the subtitles, please?
بكره فضيت حالك في امبارح
ليه؟
تيكو وليفربول
لا والله ما انا فاضي.
انا بكره بدرس والريال 5:30 ليفربول 7 على مصدر 7:30.
انت فاضي بكره؟ المفروض بكره اجازه.
ما هو لا اليوم انا بدرس كل يوم ساعتين كل يوم بدرس 5 ساعات اخلص مادتين 3 رايح الجامعة.
Mr. Hazem,
Yes.
can you mute all for all participants?
I am okay. Can I mute all? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I think it's done. I'll see if I can enable transcriptions. Doesn't seem to work. How can I add? How can I add transcript? Okay, can wait a couple more minutes until everyone's here, and then we'll start. I don't seem to have the live transcript option for subtitles. Can someone else activate them from the hosts? All right, let's start. Let's start. So today we are going to go through the third part of our React.js training. Can everyone hear me and see my screen, please? Can you confirm? Okay, great. So let's get started. We'll start with a quick review of what we've done last week, so everyone's memory is fresh. What we did last week is that, let me zoom in. We created a new React project using create React app command. So we created the project that we called Game On React. And we did that by using basically npx create React app and the name of our app, which generated a code boilerplate for us that we will see in a second, on which we started working. Let's get rid of this. Let's start our project, npm start, so we can take a look at what we've done so far. I don't have the subtitles option. Does the host see it? I don't seem to have that option on my side of things. I don't know if BGI has the option or can launch the subtitles. Okay, so I don't seem to find the option for the subtitles. So if someone in the other host has it, please enable it. All right. Let's get back to what we were doing. So we started our app and we have, let's push this to the side and see what we've done. Okay, let's close all of this and go take a look at our app. Okay, it's a bit laggy. Please 1 second. I'm going to see why it lags. Okay, so we should go now to our local host and the 3000 port. And we should have our app. Fine. So we had an API which loads a certain amount of titles that we are having here. We're loading from the API the information and mapping it to different items. We can add what we added as well. We added the ability to add a new title, for example, Zelda genre RPG, year 1997, and the developer. And we saw how we could add new titles thanks to this. How we did that, we saw how we could create class components. We created class components, so how we must extend React component to create a class component. We saw how to create state, how we can update our state, and how we can pass props to every component from its parent. Starting from the app, we also added routing, where we can basically switch from a page to the other using game list in my cart. We will work on my cart today, by the way. And how we did that is use React router to basically define a switch with different routes, taking a path and a component to display. We switch between routes using links, which work like the A tag in HTML to have a switch from a route to the other. Let's go to the game form, where we basically done everything. We saw, like we just said, the set state function, how to access props, how we can pass props from a parent to a child, and how we can have data go back to a parent from its child thanks to a function that adds it to its own state. For example, here we have the game cards as props. We have the game form, and we have the list here, which is a parent with the game form and the game cards. We have the state here, and we're passing to a child here, which is our form, a function on submit that will update its parent state to get the data. We also saw various lifecycle components, like component did mount and component did update, that allows us to execute code at different stages of updates in our components. We also saw how to add CSS, how we can style NGS, and all this kind of stuff. So according to what we did the last couple of weeks, does anyone have any questions while reviewing it this week? Or is everything clear up to this point for everyone? And we can then move forward with the lessons. Okay. No questions? Okay, let's move forward then. The route. How say it? What is unclear with the route for you? Yes? Yes, the route, we saw it in the last session. I don't understand the question. What is your question, Hassan? You can tell me through voice. The BTI should have uploaded the lessons on YouTube, I think. I will share the link when I get the YouTube link for the previous
Hello,
session.
Mr. Hazem.
Hello, Hussein.
I'm talking about the previous session. You
Yes,
talk about the route.
yes.
I
talked.
asked it before to get the video to review and what I can say.
Oh, okay. About the video, I didn't get the link myself. That's why I didn't send it to you. But I believe BTI is uploading all videos to YouTube. And as soon as I have the links myself, I will share them with you at that moment.
They should share the video after the session.
Yes, but I don't have the video since the recordings are saved to BTI's cloud. So I depend on them sending me a link as well.
Okay, I will ask BTI. Thanks, you can go on.
Okay, thank you. So let's move forward. Yes, Tarek, switch is actually, let's go back to switch. Switch is basically where we define the different routes we have. Basically what switch does is it says if the URL matches this, then display the component that is in its child, basically. That's what switch does. To navigate from page to page, we use link, like here. But if we link to a page that doesn't exist, then we can't, switch doesn't work. We need, like you see here, we're linking to paths we have declared in our switch routes. So if all of that is clear, let's move forward with today's lesson. So what we'll see today is we'll finally take a look at functional components and React hooks. Since until now, we've worked with class components. Now we'll work with functions. We'll see about state management and how it is done with Redux. We'll then take a short break before finishing the session by seeing another way to manage state instead of Redux. We'll try replacing Redux with Recoil. Then we'll take a look at interesting React libraries made by the community and how we can use them. And finally, we'll end it by building and deploying our application on Netlify. So that's what we'll do today. Let's start with functional components and hooks. So what are functional components and why should we use them instead of class components? So functional components have always been with React, but they weren't as used because you couldn't do many of the basic React features. Basically, function components had no state, and they have no lifecycle methods. No component did mount, no component did update, nothing of that. So they were very limited, and we used to call them stateless components. But things changed because on React 16.8, they added hooks to functional components, which made them extremely strong. And now you can basically, in most cases, never write class components if you want to. You don't even need to write them anymore. In modern React, there's a lot of based a lot on functional components. So functional components are basically just plain JavaScript functions that accept their props as an argument to the function. They have no render function inside them. Instead, we will return the GSX from that function. We have no access to lifecycle methods, but they are replaced by hooks. And using hooks, we can do most of what lifecycle components used to enable us to do anyway. So hooks, like I said, are a new addition in React 16.8. And they let us use state and listen to our components updates, basically when we're updating props or state. And all of that without relying on class components lifecycle methods like the component did mount, component did update, etc. So most important default React hooks that you must remember, because they will be used a lot, is use state. That will replace basically the state and set state, and use effect, which will replace our lifecycle methods. But we can also write our own custom hooks to simplify certain aspects of our code, and it's something that we will see together as well today. So let's jump into the code. To make it clearer, let's create our first function component. When you'll tell us about use effect component. Use effect is a hook, not a component, and I'll talk about it right now. I will jump into the visual code, and I will use state, and I will use effect, and we will create our own custom hook as well. So I'll tell you all about it right now. So let's get into the code. Let's go to our cart, since it's a simple component. And this is a class component, right? We are going now to convert it to a function component. And you'll see that it's actually very easy, because what we do is, instead of having a class and which extends the React component, all we need to do is have a function called cart that basically takes props as parameters, and we get rid of the render function, and we return the JSX directly, and basically that is it. This is a function component. This is a functional component. And let's go take a look at our code here, and you'll see that my cart still works fine. We can even add, I don't know, hello, this is your cart. Hello. Props. Another big difference in functional components that we don't need to use this anymore, since we're not in the class. We can use props directly. So props dot hello, and that's it basically. And now we can, oh, we don't need this, by the way. Let's go here, and if we add to the cart, we add the props to it. We add hello. So students will see that now we are getting our hello, and everything works fine. So that is basically what the function component is. We don't need a class, we need to extend anything, and the JSX is returned directly by the function instead of being returned by the render function of the class. Okay, the window is very small. Okay, let me zoom a bit then. Is this better? Is this okay? Okay, so we'll probably not use the context API with the user reducer and use context today, but because we'll be seeing other state management solutions like Redux and Recoil anyway. And use reduce and use context are basically hooks that are here to state manage and replace these libraries. But I don't think that you'll be using them much, because according to React developers themselves, use context is not made for frequent updates, which makes it not that useful, because you can only use it for states that you don't update much. So we'll be seeing other alternatives instead. But if you want us to go through them, yeah, we can go through them real quick anyway. But most importantly, let's take a look at both hooks that you'll be using a lot. And these are the use state hook. And you remember in classes what we did. Let's take a class. Let's take a class component like our game form. And you'll see that basically what we did is we declared the state, and then we change it using this .set state. In function components, how we do that, we don't have set state and we don't have state. What we do is we use basically, let's say, let's get rid of this. And let's have, for example, hello, set hello, which are from React dot use state, and we give it an initial value, hello students, for example. And now we can directly use hello here. Let's take a look. You can see it says hello students because it takes that state. It's taking that state with its default value that we have declared here. So this is basically how we declare state. Now, if we want to change our state, we can have it like this. Let's have a div. Let's add a button. And give it on click. I wanted to have a function. I wanted to set hello to not students, but let's say hello engineers. And you'll see now that we're trying to set the state. Let's take a look. It says here, hello students. As soon as I click me, it should become hello engineers. And that's exactly what it does. So this is how we use hooks, basically to replace state in function components. That's not very complex, but it is quite different from how we do it in class components, basically, because we don't have access to this .set state. Is that clear for everyone up to this point? Okay. Now we're changing the state, right? So it should update our component. So if we had component did update, like we do have it here, it should trigger this, right? But we don't have component that did update. So what if we want something to happen whenever we basically set hello? I want here another, let's add another thing here and have it be button or say hello, the hello value changed times. Basically, I want to display here how many times I've changed hello. What we do is let's first add our counter, set counter. Let's add another React state. And have it start at 0. Basically now I want every time my hello value to change, I wanted to add 1 to my counter. So how I do that, I don't have component did update to see if my hello changed. We use, in this case, use effect hook. How to use the use effect hook is that we go through React and have it use effect. And use effect basically takes as a parameter a function that will basically contain all the logic you want executed during the effect. And let's have here set hello being, set counter equals counter plus 1. And now you will notice that we'll have an error, a bug in our code, is that it will not add +1, but you'll see it will add indefinitely a lot of, look, the value has changed thousands and thousands of times. Why is that? It's because actually what is happening is our use effect is executed every time there is an update to either the state or the props of the component. Since I'm updating the counter, this gets executed again, and it updates again, and it gets executed again indefinitely. So it's basically going to add +1 indefinitely. Iman Ibrahim asks why we use callback function in onClick. Because I want to pass a value to set hello, and onClick takes a function, not a function execution. So we can't have it like this because this is not a function. This is a function execution. We need a whole function. That's why we declare a new function there. And yes, Tarek, these are hooks. And let me go back and explain the problem we are having right now with this counter going to the millions indefinitely. So basically what we want is we don't want this execute when the counter is updated. So we want to give it what we call dependencies. React use effect takes another parameter apart from the function, which is an array of dependencies. Basically what this says, it says, hey, only execute the use effect if the values inside the array change. And we want this to change only, execute only when hello changes. So when we do that, the use effect won't be executed for counter because counter is not in the dependencies. If we get rid of the dependencies altogether, it will execute for everything. And if we want to if we wanted to execute only when the component is starting, we declare an empty array of dependencies, which means the use effect will only execute on the mounting of the component. So basically, with empty dependencies, this is like component did mount, and with dependence without anything, it's like component did update. But we can go even further by saying component did update which value. So if you put hello here as a dependency, it will stop executing every time the counter changes, and it should this time be at 1. Why? Because like we said, it will execute at least once when the component is mounted. So let's go here and have it be -1, so we can execute it. So when it starts, it is at 0. So now every time we click, hello changes and it adds +1. But here, since the value doesn't change, it stays at engineers, it will only count 1 time. So we should get here and have, let's say it here, set hello, maybe math.random. And now it should change. See, it's 0, so now it will change every time we click. It will count how many times hello changed. That's how basically how the use effect, works. So what we need to keep in mind is the function and the execution and the dependencies. Is there any questions up to this point? Let's make sure everyone is on the same page here. Okay, there doesn't seem to be any questions. There is one last thing that we can do with use effects, and it's basically what we call cleanups. So what is a cleanup? Let's say what we want to do is have, I don't know, let's get rid of the counter. And instead of the counter, let's have message, set message. And let's have it start. I want to set the message to be all of this. Let's get rid of this, have it only be the message. And here I want the message to be, I don't know, for example, hi, the new value is, excuse me, message plus, let's have this here, is plus our hello value. Let's take a look. So now it says, hi, the new value is students. And we click, it's the students point, and it keeps getting bigger because what we do here is we have message.hello. So every time it's going to append the new value of hello at the end. What if we wanted to clean every time we change the value, wanted to get started empty again? What we do is that we add a cleanup method, which is going to be basically set message to be like this. So when we return something, it is considered a cleanup in use effect. So let's see, now it doesn't change at all. So cleanup should be, okay, maybe I chose a bad example. Cleanup, let's have something else. How can I show you the cleanup in this context? Cleanup is used mainly for event listeners. So maybe I'll show you, but I'll show you how it's really used. Maybe it's more interesting. Let's have it like this. Okay. Let's say now we want, okay, I have an idea of how we can manage this. Here, you remember the ref where we took this.ref and like button ref, button ref. It's a good occasion as well to show you the use ref hook. Const button ref, use ref. It's like, basically, it's like this .ref that we used in the class components when we are using, when we're doing the event binding in the last lesson. So basically what we want is we want when the component is mounted, so with an empty dependency, we want to add an event listener to the button ref dot current dot add event listener, click, and I wanted to set hello to the okay. Now it should work. Use ref. Okay, React dot use ref. So now if we go here, so use ref is not defined. What do you mean? We changed it, right? Let's refresh. Okay, fine. Now if we click, it works as usual because we're using an add event listener. But what's bad about this is if we go back here and come back here, it looks like it still works like it should, but let's take a look at this. Let's add something here so you can understand what I mean. Let's console.log. Or maybe just, so basically when we open an add event listener, it doesn't get removed. So when we go here and go back again, we're attaching a new event listener. So a good practice in code is to actually remove that event listener as a cleanup. So basically the code that remove event listener, and let's have this as a const handle hello updates. Let's have this here, maybe to make it easier. Dates. There we go. So basically what that does, we tell it when it updates, I want you to remove the event listener before adding a new one. That's called a cleanup. So in functionality, it doesn't change anything to how it looks, but this makes our code more optimized because we don't keep event listeners we don't need. If that makes sense to you guys, I don't know if I'm being clear with this. So when we use summary about use effect, okay. I'll answer your question. I see a lot of people are not very don't understand use effect a lot, and I see. So sorry, Fouad says sorry, but the class component, will I use it or not in the future? Yes, you probably will use it if you are writing in a client's code that you didn't write yourself. Maybe you're using an older version of React because hooks are relatively new, like I said. So for older projects, you'll probably find a lot of classes. But if you're writing a new project yourself, you will probably want to write functions more because they are easier, but it will actually depend on what you want to do. Basically, there are two options, and it's up to you to choose which one you want to use. Classes are not going to go away, and functions neither. So it's up to you to choose what you want to use. But you should know both, because sometimes you will be working with other developers who already made the choice and you need to understand their code. So can I explain again the use effect hook? Of course. So basically the use effect hook, let's have another example. Let's start a new, let's have, for example, here, let's have a counter. And here, set counter, and it starts at 0, right? And we want, let's say we want when it reaches 10, we want an alert to be displayed. So basically, we want the code to tell me, what we want is that I want the code to tell me when I reached 10. So what I do here, let's have set counter, and here, let's get rid of the ref because, or let's keep it maybe. So we can update this handle counter increment. And what we'll do here is that we'll set the counter at counter +1, right? So what that will do is we'll have a counter, set counter +1. Why is it not working? Button ref. Listener state set counter. Let's take a look what's happening here. Do we have an error? No. Okay. Button ref, add event listener, handle counter increment, set counter. Maybe let's get rid of this, by the way, to make it clearer, and let's have it here. On click, equal set counter plus 1. Let's keep it simple. Okay. Now it's adding a counter, and as much as I click, the counter gets up. So I want an alert to be displayed when I reach 10. So what I will do is I need to basically check counter's value. So what I'll do is I'll declare a use effect, which takes a function that I want to execute, and dependencies. Here we'll have counter as a dependency. And basically what I will do is I will say, hey, if counter is superior or equal to 10, then please alert me, hey, your counter went above 10. Okay? And basically what this does is going to listen to all, excuse me, to all updates made to its dependency. So basically all updates made to counter. Every time the value of counter changes, this function is going to be executed. And if the new value is superior or equal to 10, I wanted to display an alert, and I wanted to set the counter back to 0. Okay? Let's try this. So basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, hey, your counter went above 10. Okay? And my counter gets back to 0. So this is maybe a simpler example. Is that clearer? Matt? What do you mean, Tarek, by counter callback to reference? We can do this without use effect. Yes, you can basically have this. This is a simple example, but we can have this here. It's true. We can actually do this by putting all this logic in here. So basically, we can have in every time we set the counter, basically what we could do, we could replace use effect by having a function here, having handle counter inc, and have it be like this, and have this be here. If counter plus 1. Yeah, we could do this. Sandus, it's true. And we need to call this, of course, here. We could do this and it will still work. It's true. But your examples are not always as simple as the example I use here. Here I'm using one value. So for example, what you have, if you have multiple values changing a lot of things, or if you want to basically do what we did here. Let's say you want to go to, what is it? The list. And you want to have this.games.land that comes from the state. It can get more complex. So use effect is actually better to handle these kind of things because that's what they're made for. They don't take space up in your function memory. They're handled by React every time there is a change to a state. I mean, that's why we use states anyway, because we want this to update things. And that's React's way to handle data binding. And the array of use effect for what? So basically, Sun's actually a question why we use it actually can be applied to all of React. Why do we use React at all? Why not use vanilla JavaScript? It's not like we can not do data binding and all of this in vanilla JavaScript without React. But React makes it easier for us, and use effect makes it easier for us to track changes to our component state. Basically, that's the only reason. There is no other reason for it. Just easier. Counter variable and the array of user effect for what? What the counter variable here in the array is for, it is actually to, it's called a dependency. And as we said earlier, that's what we want to use when we want use effect to trigger only for one specific change. If we don't put counter in this array, it will change for any update of the component, even in props. If the props change, this will execute. A good example for that is like I showed earlier when we have set counter +1, and it keeps executing all the time. So actually, it's a dependency. This is which change we want to execute the use effect for. Otherwise, it's going to be executing a lot of times and it's not optimal. A good example of this I will show you is, for example, if I do const test, set test, and let's have this react.use state who. And what you'll see is that if I do this here, and here I will say console.log use effect is executed. What you'll see here is that use effect is going to be executed twice every time I run my counter. As you can see here, I will zoom to my console. So here, whenever I click on the button, okay, what, 1 second, set test bar. Let's say here, let's have this here. Okay. You'll see what it says. You see it says too many renders, re-renders. React limits the number of renders to prevent an infinite loop. It's because here what is happening is that this updates and executes our use effect, which basically creates a loop. We don't want this to be executed every time. We want it to be executed only for counters. That's why we put counter here. Let's say if we do this like that, excuse me, if I put this here, this won't create a loop because we already have the counter. If we do like this, it executes once. But if I get rid of this, it will create an infinite loop. Let's load again. Executed foobar plus counter, actually. So the value changes. You see how many times his effect is executed? Twice. Every time I click, it is executed twice, 2 times. That can be basically handled if I only tell it to execute for the counter, only the counter. So now it will execute only once. See? I don't know if this is clear for you, Mahmoud. Is it clearer, Mahmoud? Okay, good. So basically, it's called a dependency. It's to tell use effect what variables we want to listen to. Okay, we'll finish this by creating our own custom hook. Let's say we want to here display. Let's get rid of all of this. And let's say here we want to display window width, and here we want to display the window height. You could have here window dot inner width, and we could have this here window dot inner height. And as you can see, this doesn't change. If I change the size of my window width and height don't change. We can actually create a custom hook to basically follow these changes. Let's create a new folder that we'll call hooks. We'll create a hook called use window dimensions. And basically, what is a custom hook here? A custom hook is basically a React. Excuse me. Custom hooks is a custom React function. It's a functional component without the return. Excuse me. So basically what we want to do is we start by we start by here adding a new function component. Let's call it function use window dimensions. Okay. And here we want to return, not return, excuse me, export default use window dimensions. And now we want to hold the state. We are going to use state. Let's import React. Import React from React. So you can use state. Here we're going to have const size, call it window size to be clearer. Window size, set window size equal React dot use state, and have it be an object with the width. Let's have it undefined for now, or let's set it by default to the window dot inner width, and height, let's have it be window dot inner height. So this is to track the changes in our values. And okay. Then what we want to do is we will add a new use effect as well. React.use effect. We want it to run only once when it starts. And basically, what are we going to do in this use effect? In use effect, we're going to add event listeners to the window on resize. So we're going to do window dot add event listener on resize. And what we want to do here is we're basically going to set the width and height again to the inner, and so we can have set window size. Like this, whenever the event listener is triggered, right? And then we return a cleaner function, a cleanup function. We can actually do this here. You can get rid of this to maybe have code that is easier to read. We can have this here be replaced with, let's say here, handle read size. Oh, actually, let's do it here. Const handle resize and have it be like this. Let's get rid of this here. Okay, and we want this to take handle resize. So this is easier to read, and we want it to return every time, like we did earlier. We wanted to remove that event listener every time we are going to change the values, so we don't accumulate many event listeners. So we'll have here resize and the resize, and this will get rid of our event listener on cleanup. This is just for cleanness of the code, because otherwise it will take up too much RAM in our system. So now what do? We have the basic functioning of our hook. All we need to do, you'll see that there is no returning GSX. And basically the only difference between a hook and a component is in the return. When instead of returning GSX, we basically return the window size. We're returning a value instead of GSX. See, all of this code, we could have done it directly in our cart here. We could have done it directly here, but this will take too much space. And especially in terms of cleanness of code, that means that every time we need this functionality of following window dimensions, we need to write this code again and have duplicate code. But when doing it like this, we can have it in separate file, and then we can import here, use window dimensions from hooks/use window dimensions. And now instead of following directly from window inner height and inner width, what we can do is have, how do we call them? We call them width and height. We can have const width and height directly from use window dimensions that we imported. And here we can have width and height. Or if you want it to be clearer, we can have just here window size. And we can put this here as well. This doesn't change anything. And now what you'll notice is that if I refresh my component, it should, okay, why isn't it not changing? Okay, something is not going on right. What is happening here? In the resize, so is it not called the resize? Okay, this is weird. Let's take a look at the resize event on MDN. Maybe I'm mistaken in terms of the resize. Okay, let's see. Report resize. Window dot on resize. Add event listener resize. Well, it should work like we did. Oh, okay. Makes sense. We need this to be here in the declared in the use effects. Okay. Otherwise it takes, okay. Let's take a look now and see if it works better. It doesn't seem to. Take a look. And then window size. Use effect. Did we make a mistake somewhere? It's here. Maybe let's have this be like this. Point and defined and have the resize here. Okay, it seems I'm making a mistake somewhere. Turn window size. Let's console.log here. Resizing. And have this take. Let's see if it's executing correctly at least. So resizing. Okay, I see the issue. The event listener doesn't seem to be working. So window here is not. Okay, event listener resize is not executing on the window. Window resize, so it should work though. Add event listener window. Can we have this though? Maybe have this like this. Window on resize and the resize. Does this work better? Yes. Okay, there seems to be an issue with the resize event listener. But as you can see here, we now have it moving as we move. As we get it smaller, it works with us and we can get it actually. Let's get rid of this, console.log. And now we have a custom hook basically. Add width and height for the effect. Actually, we don't need to add it for the use effect parameters because they are used with, they are not made in React, so they're not state or props. We need to bind it to an event listener in the window. But yeah, okay, you can see it working now. There seems to be an issue. Maybe it's not called resize. It seems to be called resize, but I mean, this works. I don't know why the add event listener method doesn't, but it seems to be working when we add it with on resize. So that's about it for custom hooks. Do you have any questions regarding that at this point? All right, so basically the only difference between a custom hook and functional component is the return. A component returns GSX and a hook returns a value, basically a state value mostly. It returns a state value. And here we can even, when we go back to our card, we can even have a use effect on the window size. We can have here a use effect. Let's have a use effect. And you'll see that it executes. So here, console.log, size changed. And we can have here the window size. And add it here as a dependency. We can add window size. So even states that come from a custom hook can actually be given to a dependency to a use effect. So actually, if we go here, you'll see that it gives us everything. Once we resize, it will actually execute the hook, the use effect hook, with a new size. So you can use a use effect as well with values coming from custom hooks. So that's about it for functional components and hooks that we're going to see at this point. And let's go forward, since we don't have time, it's pressing, with Redux state management. I think this will be more complex for those who didn't see Redux before. So what is state management exactly? So state management is simply a way to engender communication and sharing of data across components. And we already do that using props and all of this, but there is a weakness in it. In the sense that we said last time, if you remember, that props can only be passed from a parent to a child. And it's more complex to pass data from a child to a parent. And it's even more complex to pass data from a parent to a child's 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 child, because our hierarchy can get big and bigger applications when we need to send data from a parent that is far away from a grandchild component. And we will need to send the props to it child by child by child until it reaches the component we need. So state management libraries handle that for us in a more efficient way by restructuring our state. And Redux does just that by basically replacing the state with what Redux calls a store. So this is called a Redux store. Redux store is basically a state. It's like state in React, but it's a huge state that handles states of all the application, all components. It's like if you took all your components and put all of their states together and put it in one place. So that means that we wouldn't need to use state with our React components. What we would do is that we would take that state directly from the store. We take the parts of the store that we need and load them from our store and read them into our React component. That's for reading. What if we want to change values in a store? We use what is called in the Redux as actions, Redux actions. And well, these actions go through what is called a dispatcher, then a reducer to change values in the store. I know this may sound complex, and it is kind of complex. It is kind of hard to learn, but I hope it will be clearer when we get to do it inside the code. But keep in mind, our objective is basically to have a state and where we can pass data from all components more easily without having to go through difficult things like going from prop to prop, from parent to child, parent to child. So let's see how we can do this in the code. Will you explain the context before state management? The context we will. I didn't understand image resize. Okay, Muhammad, it makes it work. Actually, I didn't make it work with an additional step. If you're talking about the custom hook, actually, what I did is very easy. Is that I used this. I used on resize instead of having window dot add event listener resize and handle resize. For some reason, this event listener is not working with the window. So I tried passing it in on resize and it worked. Basically, that's all I did, Mohammed. Okay, so Tariq, you said that you didn't understand the image resize. Do you mean this about the window? Basically, what we're doing is we're creating a custom hook. Like we said, the custom hook is declared like a function component, but we just don't return GSX, we return a state element. So what we want to have a state element that basically changes whenever the window size changes. So what we did is we declared the state using the use state hook. We declared the width and the height to be undefined at the start. And then we created the use effect that is going to be executed only once because it has no dependencies. It's going to be executed only once when the custom hook starts. And what that does is that it creates a function called handle resize that basically changes, it executes the set window size, which acts like set state, to change our window size values. We execute it once, and then we add it to an event listener that basically says, whenever you resize the window, please execute handle resize, and basically it's going to get updated in the state. So then we can just return the state, and basically we'll have that state in whenever component we want. And that's called the custom hook. Ahmed Bakr asks why we did not add width and height as dependencies for the use effect functions. So we didn't add them as dependencies to the use effect function because we don't want it to execute when these change, because otherwise it will keep executing. We don't want it to. If we put width, if we put window size dot width and window size dot height here, it will re-execute the use effect, and we don't need to, because basically all we needed to do with use effect is run once, so we can attach the add event listener. We don't want to add the event listener again and again and again every time the value changes. We don't want that. Is it clear, Abu Bakr? Okay. So basically, we only put here what we want to listen to re-execute the use effect. We don't want to, sometimes we don't want it to re-execute with changes of all values. We need to think about when we need it to execute. So let's get into Redux, since time is pressing and we have a lot to see with Redux. It's actually quite complex. We'll take our time with it. If there is not enough time, we'll push back some subjects to tomorrow, because I think it's important that you understand Redux. So please ask the questions, because we need to understand it. So let's get started with Redux. Okay, we want to add, first of all, we want to add the Redux library. So we can go and see React Redux. And you see they have a nice website here when you can get started. And it basically tells you how to install. So what we need is that we will need to install React Redux, but we'll also need to install Redux. So let's get here. Let's get to our terminal, close our application, and let's have npm I, say Redux, and as well as, React Redux. We want to have them both in our project dependencies. So let's install those. Okay, it's installed. So let's start again. Let's start our projects again. Okay. So now let's get back to our project. And here we'll have everything working as it used to work. So let's start. First things first. As you saw here, we have the basic of it all is the store. So first thing we need to create is we need to create a store. And you can see how it's done here, basically. And we need a provider, we have hooks, we have everything that is in the documentation here anyway. If you need more information on Redux, please go see their official website. There are even tutorials and everything. As you can see in the tutorial, basically, I'm sorry. So let's get started with our own functioning. So first thing we need to do is basically we go here and let's create a new folder and we'll call it Redux. Let's create a new file. We call it store.js. I'm sorry, I'm a bit sick. First thing we need to do is have our configure store function. Let's take it from here. We can see in the API we can search. I wanted to see how we can use this. So accessing the store. Let's have the store here. So we use the store hook. Okay. So what we want actually to do is we'll create our store actually directly here, maybe in the app. Maybe you don't need to do it from here because we're using hooks. Let's do it the hooks way. What we do is that we need to have here, let's turn our app into a function component so we can use the new Redux hook function app, and we'll have it be like this. Let's have directly the return. Now it should work. We should be having everything working fine. Let's now add here what is called use store. Let's have our store equal use store, as we can see in the official documentation. You can see in the official documentation, by the way, here, the use store. So let's have it come from, let's import it. We need to import use store from React Redux. And we'll also need to add another thing here that's called the provider, because we need it as you see here. So what is the provider? It's like we need to create our store. Like I said in Redux, we have a big state. This is like a state for the whole of the application. And what we need to do is we need to wrap all of our app. We will wrap it in what is called the provider, and we'll give it the store equal store that we just created. All right. And this is basically how we create a store. Okay, please ensure the component is wrapped in a provider. We just wrapped it in the provider. do you mean? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. We need to have here function, another function component that we'll call root. I'm sorry, and we'll have this here, and we'll have the provider here, because it wants the whole component to be wrapped actually. So what we need to do is have the store here and store like this, and we'll need to have the app here actually. And let's get rid of this and this, and here return the root instead of the app. It should work now. Go. Context value. Please ensure the component is wrapped in a provider. It is wrapped in a provider. What do you mean? It is wrapped in a provider. Provider app. Okay, let's maybe give it a context. Maybe it lacks a context. What is it called? Create context. But create context. And we can give the context here. Cool. Context, is that what's missing? Maybe. Let's see here. No, it's still the same issue. So please let me take a look at this. Maybe it's time for maybe a short break anyway. So I'm gonna go take some medicine. I'm a bit sick, as you can see from my voice. Let's take a quick break and get back to Redux in 15 minutes, if you guys agree. Okay. Okay, then let's take a quick break and I'll see you guys in 15 minutes. Okay. Bye. Hi. The break should be over. So is everyone here? And thank you for everyone wishing me a good recovery. Are you guys back from the break?
Yes, we will.
Good. So let's get back into.
We can't hear you if you are talking.
Oh, it seems I am muted. I'm sorry. So my bad. So like as I said, I was saying, I'm sorry, I got a bit lost there just before the break on starting things up with Redux. So let's start over on a clean slate and start creating our store, which as we can see here is the basis of everything in Redux and is going to hold all of our states. So let's start by creating a file called store.js in the Redux folder and start with our store. So basically what we need to create a store is we need a function called create store that we're going to import from Redux. So create store, and we're going to have from Redux. Okay, this is how we create our store. Then what we need to do is have here our store equal create store, and the create store takes a couple of parameters. The first parameter is our first reducer. So let's say here we have let's start by building a counter, which is the easier example, and then we'll go into more details from there. So let's have a counter reducer that we still haven't declared yet, of course. And let's export our store. So this is a store that is created. So a store always uses one reducer. Reducer being, if we go back and look at our graph, the reducer is at the center of the store and is basically the entity managing states. So everything you want to have, like let's say you want to use Redux with a counter or anything like that, or loading or authentication, games, movies, you're going to have a reducer that basically manages all changes, adds, removes, all CRUD operations for a specific entity. So here we're going to have a counter reducer. So we're going to build a counter like we just built. I see some people asking what's Redux. So maybe I'll go back to the presentation and talk a bit more about it. I don't know if you remember, but we talked last week about passing state between components. All right. We have state, for example, and let's go back here. We have in the list, we have a state here, we have functions, and we're passing data from this component to its children using props, right? But here we only have a few components. What if we have hundreds of them? Using props can become a bit difficult. For example, if you want the game's data to reach a component under games form, another one and another one, if we go to games form and we add multiple components, we'll need to add from component to send it from a component to the next using props to send the data. What Redux does is facilitate this transfer of data between components. So it makes it way easier to get data from a component to the next without having to rely on props. So we can still use props basically for simple operations when you want to send data from a parent to its child, but we can rely on more complex, for more complex use cases, we can rely on Redux to help us send data and get data from components that are far from each other in terms of hierarchy. Is that a bit clearer in terms of the theory as to why we use Redux, why we will use it? We'll see how it works in practice. I hope that's more clear, but basically that's what Redux will be used for. We'll use it to send data from component to another component. Okay, so let's get back to it. We created our store, but our store needs at least one reducer, which we do not have at this point. So we'll go here and we'll create, under Redux, we create a new folder called reducers, where we will have all of our reducers. We'll create a counter.js, and this will be basically our counter reducer. So how do we declare a reducer and what is a reducer? As we look at it here, a reducer is going to basically look almost or always the same. So basically what a reducer is you're going to have, it is going to be a function and a state. So let's say here, excuse me, we need to declare in every reducer, we declare what we call an initial state, which is going to be an object. Okay, and let's say here we're going to have in the initial state counter equal counter is 0. This is what we start with. This is the initial state in our store. So now what the reducer is going to be is it's going to be a function called counter reducer. And what it's going to do, it's always going to look the same. It takes basically a state, which is going to be either a new state or by default, it's going to be the initial state. And it's going to take an action, which we can see in the graph, by the way, here. As you can see, it takes an action being dispatched and it takes a state. Basically, when we dispatch an action, the dispatcher is going to give us a new version of the state to get in the reducer, and the reducer will return a new state. So we get an action, we get a state of a new state, an updated state. So we take an action as an input. That's what we know, and we need to return a new state, right? That's what we need to do. So how we do that is basically very simple, is we're going to go and have a simple switch case for our actions. And let's say, for example, we're going to have, by default, we're going to return state. And if the action is if the action is I'm sorry, let's say action.type, I'm sorry, switch case on action.type. If action.type is increment counter, let's have it. Usually it's the standard to write action types in all uppercase. This is just the standard. So developers understand each other. So if it's an increment counter, what we will do is that we will return, like we do with set state, and usually in React, we will return the rest of the state, and counter is going to be state.counter +1, right? This is a basic reducer. And since we're returning, we won't need breaks. So this is what we call a reducer. It's always going to take an initial state as default. And actually, it's not obligatory, not always, I'm sorry. You can have it be empty, but it is recommended to always have an initial state. And it's always going to be a function that takes two parameters, the old state and an action, and it's always going to return a new state. Is that clear up to this point? It will actually get clearer when we start using the actions. Okay. So now, as what we saw, and let's go back to our, I see there is no questions. We know the view, it's our React component. We created the store and we created the reducer. And we know what the reducer needs is an action, an old state, and it returns a new state. So now what we need to do is basically we need to go back to our code. And first of all, we need to export this, the reducer, and then make sure this is imported in our store, since our store needs it counter reducer from reducers counter. So this is good. But now next step is we need to bind the store to our app, right? We need to come to our app here and bind its state, basically. So what we will do is that we will go to the index here, where we call our app, okay? And what we'll do is that we'll call the provider here. We have something called provider that helps us bind a store to our app. We'll import the provider from React Redux, since this is specific to React. And by the way, you can use Redux outside of React. But with React, we need a provider that will bind everything to our app. So we'll take our app and we put it inside the provider. But our provider also needs basically the store. So what we'll do is that we'll import our store from Redux store. So now we just need to call this here, store. And now what that means is basically everything in our reducers, all states in our reducers, here we only have counter, is accessible from any component in our app, any component. We're going to look at it now. Let's see our application still runs fine. Now let's go to my cart. And let's say in my cart, I want to replace this logic with the counter. I want to go to my cart here. And I'm going to basically maybe get rid of this for now. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to try and get my counter value in here. I'm trying to have here counter. And I want my counter value that is declared in our Redux store to be read here. Okay. So how will we do that? We will use what is called selectors in React Redux. All right. 1 second. Oh. All right. We're going to call use selector from React Redux. Here, we're going to import use selector from React Redux. Okay. And now we should be able to use this use selector to get basically anything. Let's see here. Let's see what we can get. Let's have const counter be equal to use selector. What use selector does is it takes a function that returns our whole state. And here we should be having state dot directly dot counter. Let's take a look and see if that works. Let's see if we did it right. I made a mistake in the, oops. What happened to my Google Chrome? Chrome. Okay. Selector. Made a mistake in the name. Okay. You'll see now, okay. You'll see now that my counter works and I'm getting the data and I didn't need to use props or anything. And I can use the selector anywhere I want. All I have to do is take this line of code and call it in the component where I need the value to get the value. I don't need to pass props. I don't need to do anything. It's like if we have one giant JavaScript object that we can read from anywhere, basically. That's how
Global
Redux
variable.
works. Yes, in concept, it is very much like global variables. But in the context of React, it's like if you had one big global where you have your variables and everything, and it's called a store.
I want to ask about use selector state variable. From where you call?
State always returns anything in your reducer. So basically, it's going to be this. What is returned by your reducer? See, store takes only one reducer, and the state is going to be equal to the data you have in your reducer.
Yes. Okay.
So see, this is kind of complex in terms of writing the Redux logic, but then it makes easier the transfer of data because you can read data anywhere you want without having to send it through props.
It's complex, really, but with the practice, it will be simpler.
Yes, with practice, it is simpler, but actually we'll see an alternative later that was made by Facebook called Recoil, which actually does the same thing that Redux does, but in a way simpler manner. So now let's finish looking at the basics of Redux. If no one else has any questions, I don't know if you have more questions before we move on to basically we're reading now our counter, but we still haven't incremented anything. We didn't change a value. We want this to become 1 and 2 and 3, etc. And I wanted to read it from anywhere, right? So what's interesting is that let's do something really cool is that we'll take this, so you can understand me, we'll take this in the counter, the same logic, and we'll go and add it to our list, basically. And let's have it here. and basically have on top, oops, oh, this is not a function. Okay, let's have another component maybe, or anything. I don't know where I can get a function. Game cards. Okay, let's turn game cards into a function component, so you can use hooks here. I really prefer hooks. Function, game cards, and it's going to take like literally nothing, and all it's going to do is like this, and then we can return the GSX, and it's done. Game cards is now a function component. Let's say we come to game cards and we add this logic of use selector. Import use selector from React Redux. And let's say here before our game data, we also display here our basically our count. Let's have here h1 counter. So I want it to be displayed at 2 places so you can understand the use of it. So you see here we have counter 0, and if we go to game list, props of undefined. Where is the props? Okay. We need to have props here and get rid of this for a fully functional function component. So there we are. You'll see that now we have the counter, and maybe actually we'll put it a bit up so it doesn't break our CSS. Okay, so we see have counter 0 here and have counter 0 here. I have it at 2 places in 2 different pages. So now let's go to my cart and add a way to basically increment this counter. Okay, so what we've seen is that we created in our reducer, we said when we have an action called increment counter, then we will increment. So let's go back to our cart here. And basically what we'll do to change our values is what we see here. Like I showed in the presentation, what we need now is to dispatch an action. So first we need what we call a dispatcher. How do we get a dispatcher? It's very easy with hooks. We call dispatch equals use dispatch. That's it. And we need to have the use dispatch imported. And now all we have to do is dispatch and give it an action. An action is always an object. Here, if we go to our dispatcher, we see that we are, from the action, we are expecting a type, which is going to take this if we want to add +1. So what we'll do is that we'll dispatch an action, which has a type, and the type is going to be increment counter. Okay? This is basically how we increment, but we want this not to be done like this. We want it to go through a button. So button is going to be click me, and in the button here we're going to have on click. We're going to have it execute the dispatch. Okay. So now, if we go back to our application, if we call click here, we should see our counter get incremented, right? And what's really interesting here is that if we go to a different page, see our counter is at 4 here, right? If you go back to the other page, the counter is still at 4. And we didn't need to find a way of communicating between both pages. This would have been very complex to do without Redux, because cart and game list are not in the same branch of the hierarchy. If we go to components here, like I showed you last time, if you look here, you'll see that basically game cards and our cart, not only are they not in the same hierarchy, but when I'm on the game cards, actually, my cart isn't even loaded because it's a different page. But still, we can get the same value because they share a store thanks to Redux. So all data is saved on the Redux store, or what you might call a state. Yes, so all data is saved on Redux state, or as Redux called it, the store. So after this, the diagram I showed you should make a lot more sense. Whoops, why did it reload? Let's get back to the diagram. This diagram should make a lot more sense now. So we have here a React component that, like the one we have. Like let's go back to a diagram. I'm sorry. So as we're looking at on the diagram, we have a React component, which is going to be our cart, for example, or our cards list, or whatever component we want. The component is going to have an action and a dispatcher, which will run through a reducer, which will have communication with the store and give us back a state to use in any React component we want. So all React components might share one single state. Is it clear for everyone? Do you have any questions? I know Redux can be a bit complex, so please ask questions while we're on a simple example. Yes, the store is basically the state. The store is the whole spectrum. A store is what has the reducers and states. You might notice on the diagram that there are little R's in the reducer, many R's. So what is that? Let's get back to our code. I want to ask you something. Now, what if we want to have another reducer? What if I don't want to have only the counter? What if I want to have here another one that's going to be, I don't know, games? And here I wanted to have, let's say, for example, I wanted to replace the list here. See the list here with the games? What if I want to get rid of this state and put it in my Redux store so everyone has access to the games and I don't have to use my props? So here, what we might do is that we'd create another reducer for the games. But, well, let's write another reducer like we did earlier, initial state equal games. We're gonna have it an empty array. Okay, and we can have our const games reducer with basically the state, which by default is the initial state, and an action. And as usual, we're going to have switch cases. And we're going to have a switch case on an action type. And we're going to have a case, for example, set games, for example. And in set games, you want to return state and games action dot payload, which is going to be the new games you want to add. We'll see in the example later on. And we can have a default returning basically the state as it is. So this is our games reducer, right? Export default games reducer. But now if we go to our store and try to add our basically games reducer, you'll notice that the store only takes one reducer as a parameter. It doesn't take an array of reducers. If I do this, games, this doesn't work if I give it an array, because it doesn't expect an array of reducers, it expects only one reducer. So what we do here is there is actually a really great function in Redux that we might use, which is called combine reducers, which we will be able to use to basically have all reducers into one, to fuse our reducers into one reducer. So as we can here, we can have root reducer, and we can, what we do here with the root reducer is we are going to use from here, we can import combine reducers. And here we can give it combine reducers. And basically it takes an object where we can give it keys and reduce. So basically we can say counter state is, or we have counter is counter reducer, and games is games reducer. So what that does is that actually it fuses both reducers into one reducer that we can give here. So Muhammad Al-Balawi asks if I want the counter to count when click button, and in the other page count number of cards. You need to have a different value in your state, because these are two different variables. It's not the same variable. What you need, Muhammad, for this case is go to your counter and have here maybe click counter and cards counter. You understand me? You understand me, Muhammad? Okay. So for every variable, you need a different variable in your state. So here, when we fuse the reducers, there is something that will change. You will notice that now our counter will not work. Actually, if we go here, you'll see that our counter, if I refresh the page, it will not work. Why? Because actually now, when you fuse the reducers using these keys, now it changes the way we access basically our selectors, because now it's no longer state.counter, it's state.counter.counter. Why? Because we need to go through the reducer we chose when we combine them. We need to specify which reducer we need now, because we combined them. So we access them with the key we given here. We can say here, for example, CR and GR, for example, and that way, when we need to access it, we'll need to go through, basically here, we need to go through, where is it? Here, instead of putting state.counter, we need to put state.cr counter. And here we need to put state.cr.counter. And now it should work. See, it works now. And what is the issue here? We seem to have an issue now here. Let's take a look. Let's get back to our cart. What did we do in the cart? Yeah, we returned the state.cr.counter. That's the issue. Okay, we just needed to refresh. So now it works again as usual. We can increase our counter and go and do whatever we want. But now we want to, like we did, we want to replace this state. So what we are going to do is that now, instead of, let's go to our list here. And instead of having state games here, let's delete this. And maybe we'll look at how we can add a Redux store to a class component? Do you guys want to see how to add a Redux store to class components, or should we stick to function components? Do you think we should change list into a function component, or would you rather we work with the class component and Redux this time? Okay. Let's work with the class so you see how it works with a class component. Actually, it is a bit more complex than with hooks. That's why I prefer hooks, but it's interesting that you know. So what we need to do is basically, we need to call for a function called connect. I'll show you right now. So when you come here in the list, we need to call now, we need to import connect from Redux instead of using use select. So here, no use selector is needed. What we will need though, is that we'll need to, through this connect, we'll need to go and have here, we need to go down and we need to create a function. I'm sorry. We'll we need to call a function called state to props, or we can call it whatever you want, which takes the Redux state like use selector. This is going to be like the use selector, and we will now return an object. And the object we're going to say, for example, games equals state.gr.games, because we have the games reducer and we put it in gr. So we're going to have these guys. So we're going to have the state.gr.games, and we put it when we use the key games. What is this key? Basically, like you see in the name of my function called state to props, what you can understand from it is that basically what it does is going to bind our state from Redux to this component's props. So what we're going to do is going to do connect, the function that we called earlier, and we're going to give it the state to props function, and it's going to take this component. So it's going to connect this component and inject the state into the props. So now instead of using state.games here, we can see if we console.log here, if we look at from Redux, and we have it here, have games from this .props.games, you will find that they were injected in, let's have it here, in the render. Oops. You'll see now that it is injected in this .props. So let's go get back here and go here, and you'll see from Redux, we're now getting the games and it's an empty array, right? So this is the first part. Second part, we want to fill this array now. So let's see. We use dispatch with hooks, but with classes, we can't use dispatch. We'll need to use something else. We'll use, like we did state to props, we'll have another function called dispatch to props. Okay. But we'll need first to import something else here from here called bind action creators, which actually not imported from here. I'm mistaken. It is called from Redux. So we call bind action creators. So this is going to bind our actions and reducers to the props like we did with the state. bind action creators. And then we're gonna come here and we'll have const dispatch to props, like we did with the state to props. Okay. And this will take basically dispatch, like we did here, state to props. Here we're going to have dispatch instead of the state, which is going to work like the use dispatch from the hooks. And here we're going to use basically map the function we just did, which is going to be, is going to return bind action creators. And what this does is it takes what we call the action creators here. It's an object, like in the states, and the dispatch function. So here, what we'll have to do, we'll do here, for example, it's going to need to be a function. So we're going to have, for example, set games. And it's going to be a function that basically returns the function that we need. We needed to take games list. And what it's going to return is going to return an action. If we go back to our games, we'll see that we have an action with the type set games that takes a payload with the list of games. So let's get back here, and we have this action be of type set games and take the payload games list. Is this so now we need to add this here as well. Dispatch to props. And now we should find a function called set games in our props. So let's get here and see if we get it, if we had it. Let's go here from Redux games, and let's take a look at set games from this .props .set games. Let's see if we're getting, let's see if we're getting a function here. Let's save and get back here. And now we should, let's refresh and see if we get from Redux. We have games and we do indeed have a function. So let's try now using this function to basically update the games like we do here. Here we do this, set state, update my games list with the new list. Let's try having this new list. Where is it? This that get my games list. Where is it? Voila. Here, let's try when we load from the API to take the list and use it on our store as well. So let's use this .props.set games and give it the list and see if this works. Let's go here and let's filter on Redux. And you can see now that the game started empty and then it filled with games. So now we can actually get rid of the state because it works fine. So we can get rid of this. We can get rid of the set state. And here we can have this here as well, instead of the set state, taking the new list. And now instead of, let's get rid of this component that update. Let's keep it, but we'll not take it from this state, we'll take it from this .props now. Let's get rid of the console.log. And instead of this .games, we'll have this .props.games injected from Redux. And now, as you can see, we got rid of the state in this component, but it will still work directly from Redux. And we can even add games like we did earlier. Let's try it out, submit new game. And see, it's added and everything works fine. So that's how you do it in React. As you can, in the class component, as you can see, it's more complex than with hooks, since you have to do all of this state to props and dispatch to props instead of more easily just, you know, using the selector and dispatch. So basically, instead of using only these two lines, when using class components, you have to do all of this to get it to work with classes. Do you guys have any questions up to this point about Redux? Any questions? Everything is clear? You guys can use React now and Redux, I mean. You guys can use Redux now in your own projects? Too much info? Yeah, it's true. It's too much info, but you'll need practice for that info to stick. So please practice. Yes, you need more practice. But once you get the hang of it, Redux comes easier, but it's a bit complex in the beginning, as you will see in the next chapter of this lesson. We'll address just that because most people actually struggle with Redux when they just start with it. So we'll see a simpler state management library. Keep in mind, for the sake of this lesson, we'll use both Redux and Recoil that we'll discover in the next chapter. But in real life, you will never, ever use two state management libraries. It's useless. Don't put two libraries that do exactly the same thing. We're going to do it now, but it's only for the sake of learning and for the lesson. You don't need to use Redux and Recoil. Either use Redux or Recoil, not both. So now, as you can see, we have Redux set to go. But let's see if we have a better way to manage our state. Let's get back to the presentation. So we went through Redux. We looked at actions, dispatchers, reducers, and state and the store. So now we're going to take a look at another method of state management developed by Facebook that is called atomic state management. That is instead of being store-based, so they got rid of the store. So why Redux isn't perfect? So when using Redux, you may have noticed from this lesson, or maybe you will notice later on during practice, that there are a few issues with Redux. One, the learning curve is steep, which means it takes a long time to basically get used to it. As you saw, even me in the beginning, I kind of struggled to remember where to put everything because you have a lot of boilerplate code, which means you need to write a lot of code to do basically not a lot. Even though that has been improved drastically by hooks, still to do anything, you need to write a reducer. You need to add the reducer to the store. You need to write your binders in the component. It needs quite a bit of code. It's not very React friendly. Why? Because React's philosophy is to cut things, basically having multiple smaller components, having small files. Everything in React is basically based on having things that are small and reusable. While Redux emphasizes one big store, which is not very compatible with React's philosophy. You might have also have noticed that Redux doesn't actually allow for async functions without a plugin. There is a plugin called Redux Thunk or Redux Saga that add this functionality to Redux, but by default, Redux doesn't allow for asynchronous function calls. Could you develop a component with subcomponent? We already did. If let's take a look. I mean, here the list is a component which has two subcomponents. Isn't that right? For a complex or large apps, the more components you have, the better. Why? Because the good thing about components is you can reuse them many places. Let's say, for example, like I explained when we started React, let's take a look at a website. Actually, let's stop for a second. Maybe this is important. Let's stop for a second and go, for example, on Twitter. And look at Twitter's UI, okay? What you will notice is that there are things that basically repeat themselves. For example, every post is the same. It's always an avatar, username, but also in who to follow, and also for your own avatar, and you only have to style it once. So yes, in large applications, it's actually very encouraged to have a lot of components with subcomponents, because components are reusable. So basically, instead of having redundancy, you put it in its own component and call it everywhere instead of rewriting the code every time. It minimizes duplication in code. So let's get back to our actual lesson on why Redux isn't perfect. So in large applications, like Hossein just said as well, you may find that the store becomes way too big, and that slows your application a lot, because we need to load the store as a whole every time to bind it to our state. So it actually may slow our application a lot if we have a lot of data in the store. And we don't have a choice but go with one store. We can't have multiple stores. So what's the solution? So Facebook recently launched Recoil. It's interesting because Recoil is still in beta. It's not a stable release. It's a brand new experimental JavaScript state management library that we're going to see together. But if you guys learn Recoil, you'll probably be amongst the first adopters and users of Recoil, because it's very new. So not a lot of people understand Recoil yet. A lot of people still work majoritarily with Redux. Most people still use Redux, but Facebook developed React and they developed now Recoil, and probably in the future, Recoil is going to become the most used state management library with React, because they are developed by the same entity, which is Facebook. So what is really Recoil is that basically it addresses many of the problems that larger applications face when using either the context API, which we didn't talk about today. It's another form of hooks, but I think if you're interested, you should look it up, but I don't think it's very necessary for what we're trying to do here. And other state management libraries like Redux. So Recoil has less concepts than Redux. There is no dispatcher, there is no actions and reducers and everything. Recoil only has two things: atoms and selectors, that we will see together. Okay? So let's take a look at how Recoil works, and let's discover it together, because actually I haven't worked with Recoil a lot myself since it's very new. let's go and access Recoil, and you can see how we can discover a new library together. So let's go Recoil.js. We should find their official website. And here is Recoil, and we can click Get Started. So you see here what this is, it's minimal and React-ish. So Recoil works in things like React, add some to your app and get fast and flexible shared state. So let's see how it works. So first of all, we'll need to install Recoil. So let's install Recoil into our application, first thing. So let's shut the app and install our new dependency. Whoops, I did it twice, Recoil. And let's install Recoil. So Recoil is installed. We can launch our app again with npm start. We can close this, it's already open in Chrome. And now we'll see how we can get started with Recoil. Basically, well, what we'll need to do, what we're going to do with it is we're going to basically deal with this form. Or maybe start with something simple. Let's rewrite a counter, just like we did with Redux. Let's write a counter with Recoil. To keep our code clean, let's add a new folder that we'll call Recoil, and have another folder called atoms, where we'll create our atoms. So first thing we'll need to do is basically like we did with the like we did here with the provider for Redux. We need to do the same thing for basically our atom, our Recoil. How that is done, as you can see in the documentation here, is by using Recoil root. So let's go here and import Recoil root from Recoil. Okay. And now what it has to do is basically all we need to do is wrap our app in Recoil root. And as you can see, we don't need the store here. There is no store in Recoil. And as I said earlier, you shouldn't use Redux and Recoil at the same time. I'm just doing it now for the sake of the lesson, so you can see both. But in real life, you use one or the other, depending on your preference and the preference of your client as well. Depends, because some clients already have code running on Redux and would rather you write Redux. So let's get started with Recoil. It's done. The Recoil is linked to our app. Now we need to go and write our atoms, basically. So let's get started. How to create an atom? It's actually quite simple. What we do is we go here in atoms, and let's say we're going to add counters here. Oops, it seems my computer is lagging a bit. Okay. So let's create a file called counters.js, or call it maybe even counter atoms. And here, what we're going to do is that, like it said here, we're going to add an atom that we're going to import from Recoil. So let's start by importing atoms. Atom from Recoil. And then we're going to, we're going to create a new atom. We'll call it the counter state, const counter state equal atom. And what an atom takes is it takes an object, and this object takes two things. One, it takes a key, what you want it called. For example, here it's text state or whatever. So it needs to be unique. So we'll call it counter state, like we called our basically the atom itself. And what it takes as well is it takes, like we see in the documentation, a default value. Default. So here we'll have, it's basically going to be the initial value. We'll put it at 0. Okay. So here what we did is we created a counter state. It's an atomic, we call it an atomic state because it only has one value. It can't be an object. And here we're going to export default or export counter. No, actually, let's make it even simpler. Let's add the export here. So we are exporting our constant, which is going to be the counter state at. So let's go to basically our cart page here. And let's get rid of the Redux logic. Okay. Let's get rid of this. And now you'll see we have no counter. If we go here, it will probably crash and saying we don't have a counter. It should. See, counter is not defined. So I know it's a lot of comments, but I don't want to delete code, so you can read it later on from the source code. So here, what we're going to do is what we're going to call the atom. It's very easy to do so. It's like with the use selector. Like you see here, we're going to use React state, use recoil state, excuse me. So how does that work? It looks exactly like use state. So we're going to go and import it. Use recoil state from recoil. And we're going as well to import our counter state from our atoms. Recoil atoms counter atoms. So basically, we're going to import the counter state, use React state, and basically what we're going to do is going to be very easy. We're just going to have exactly like when we use state. We're going to have the counter and set counter, and we're going to get them from basically excuse me, use the recoil state. Okay, and we're gonna get them from use React state, which takes as a parameter our atom state, so counter state that we created. And now it should work. We should get 0 displayed here in our cart. And all that remains is for click me to work. So let's get back to our code, and we'll see that use recoil state gives a set counter like with use state. So what we'll do is we'll come here and have set counter be counter plus 1. And now we should see it get higher and higher. Now let's get the same logic in the games cards as well. Let's go here in our components, and we should be open to game cards. And let's get rid of counter here and have exactly what we wrote in the card as our counter. Let's have it here. Let's have the counter be this. We actually don't need the set counter, so we don't care. We only want to display, and we'll actually call this from like this, and We'll now call, like we did with the cart, we're going to import use recoil state from recoil, and we're going to import our counter state from the file that we created, being in recoil atoms counter atoms. So now we should be getting the same functionality that we did with the Redux. Let's refresh. So if we get to 5, if we go to games list, it should stay 5, like you see here. If I come back here, I put it to 8, it come back, it's still 8. Is that so? That's how recoil works. With recoil has also one other interesting atom type, which is called a function that is called actually the selector. Like we see here in the presentation, I say mainly comprises of two things: atoms and selectors. We've seen atoms, but now we need to see the selectors before we are done. So what a selector is, it's basically looks like basically like an atom. Let's go back to our atoms in recoil. Let's go back to our counter atoms, and here we'll take a look at what a selector is. So basically, it's declared like this. So let's add selector here, and let's say I want my selector. Let's have export const. And let's say, what do I want to do with it? Let's say I want to get 10 times my counter every time. So I want every time to take my counter and have its multiplied value. So let's take multiplied counter. Selector. And have here selector. It takes same properties, key. Which is going to be the multiplied counter selector. But it takes another property that's more interesting, which is the get function. Basically, it takes, this is the difference between an atom and a selector. It's the second parameter is a get, which is a function that where we're going to find the get. And what we'll do with it, it's actually really fun, is that basically you can get whatever atom values you have. For example, if I have const counter equal get, and I can give it the counter state. See? Now all I need to do is return the value I want. I can return, for example, here what I'll return is I'll return my counter times 10. This is always going to be my counter times 10, whatever my counter is. So now I can go to my cart here, and I can add, like use recoil state, I can use recoil. Sorry. You can use recoil value. And here, what I'll do is I'll have my multiplied counter be equal to use recoil value of basically my multiplied counter selector. I'll give it here. Now, let's have this counter. Let's have it be times 10 equal my multiplied counter. Okay? So now we should be coming here and go to my cart, and you should see it work. So let's start it again. So 0 times 10 is 0. And it allows us to have a state derived from another state. So whenever my counter changes, its selector changes with it. So basically, that's all there is to know about Recoil. As you can see, it's way simpler and more easy to use, and you need to write less code, basically. But basically, that's how Recoil works. And it's relatively new, so still in beta. There's probably more features coming to it in the future. But yeah, that's it. Do you guys have any questions about Recoil? What do you guys think of Recoil opposed to Redux? It's normal that it's the first time you hear about it because it's very new. Like I said, it's developed by Facebook. But if you look at the version, if you go on GitHub, for example, let's go on GitHub, and you can see here it's developed by Facebook. And look at the version here, I'll zoom so you can see. The version is 0.4.1. So it's not even 1.0 yet. And as you can see, it's constantly changing. The last push to GitHub is 17 hours ago. So it's still actively being developed, but Facebook is already pushing it quite a lot. But I would be interested to know, do you guys, from what you saw, would you prefer to use Redux or Recoil? I know it's still early, but did you find one clearer than the other at this stage? Was one harder? Wasn't one more complex? Or I don't know. Redux for now? Okay. Well, practice both and see where it goes. Redux is more production ready for now. I agree with Muhammad, actually. I think Recoil is easier, but Redux is still a lot to do. And as Tarek said, we already processed a lot of information today. And it's already time to close this, to finish the session. We still have a couple of chapters, which are finishers. Basically, what we didn't get to see yet in terms of chapters, we didn't get to see the last two chapters. Basically, we didn't deploy, and we didn't see UI libraries, interesting libraries in React. What I suggest is that we do that in the last React part, which is going to be tomorrow. So you have time to process all the information you got today. And so that Hussein can fly. Because Hussein wants to fly now. So if you agree, we'll leave these two chapters for tomorrow, which is going to be our last React.js session before we split into groups and go into mobile course, where some people are going to go into React Native and others are going to go to Node.js. Before we leave each other, does anyone have any questions they want answered about what we saw today? Seems no one has any questions. I don't know if it was extremely clear or if everything was too complex for questions. Either way, what I suggest you do is review this today, review Redux. So Tarek asks, we will use GraphQL with Node.js. It is not in the plans, but we can. It is not planned that we use GraphQL. I think we're going to stick to REST, but we can have a chapter on it quickly. If you want to understand more about GraphQL, we can make that happen. We can go through it quickly, either in as a chapter in Node.js or as in coaching. But I'll try to brush on it so you can see how it is. But maybe we won't go too much into detail because GraphQL is, well, complex in its own right. So if no one has any questions, what I suggest, like I said, is that you take the time today to review, please, especially what we saw with Redux and Recoil, so that tomorrow, first thing, we review what we did today, and you can ask questions if during today's review, you felt like there was something you didn't understand, okay? I'm already vaccinated against COVID. I don't know what is happening to me today. I don't think it's COVID. I think it's the change of the weather. I think it's a cold. But yeah, I will take my medicine and be healthier tomorrow, I hope. So see you tomorrow, guys. And please, tomorrow have questions ready for me when we get back, because I know this is not so simple. Tarek says every library is made from Facebook. Not all libraries are made from Facebook, but React was made by Facebook. So a lot of good libraries around React are also made by Facebook. Redux is not made by Facebook, by the way, but Recoil is, and React is, and React Native as well. But Redux is not. Okay, so see you guys tomorrow. Goodbye. And again, please have your questions ready for tomorrow. I know state management is not so easy that you wouldn't have any questions. So please have your questions ready for tomorrow, okay? Well, goodbye, everybody. Have a nice day. And I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. Bye.